How did people in Genesis call on the name of the Lord when God didn't reveal his name until Exodus 3 in the burning bush? So that's our third question for tonight. If we have some time, we'll get to that. I saw a couple hands. Did y'all have a follow-up?
I just wanted to know, this is probably a dumb question, but what is the Nephilim? It said, you know, like in Genesis 6, it was talking about that we'll be living to be 120 years, and then it says the Nephilim were here on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. What is that?
I have a full Q&A on that very question.
Okay.
And it's on the website. So I'm just going to point you there rather than try to answer that one.
Have you already done it?
So long to
Did
do.
I miss it?
Yeah.
I missed it?
Yeah, it was a while back, but
I'm sorry.
it's all, no, that's all right. You work every other week, so.
I know, well, sorry.
Maybe they want to do it again.
I actually have some handouts and everything. If they're not posted on the website, I'll get them sent to you. And
So
everything.
that's a whole Q&A on just what that is?
Yeah, who are the Nephilim?
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
That it is, like I said, that whole first 11 chapters of Genesis, it has some really interesting,
Weird.
difficult sections in there. And a lot of times we just come down to we're not entirely sure. There are some suggestions about who they might have been. And I go through that in the Q&A on that.
Thank you.
And if I were trying to give you all the answers off the top of my head that I gave during that, I would mess some of it up. So I'm not going to try to do it right now. All right. Was there one other question somewhere? Yes, Ben?
No, I was going to say, I thought that was the last one, and I was going to say I enjoyed the presentation, except where the Garden of Eden is.
Uh-huh.
I don't know, putting it down in the Strait of Hormuz or in Turkey, I believe ignored the population areas that are included in Genesis,
Okay.
including Egypt and all that.
Yeah, because of the Cush
that
rivers.
river Gihon or Gihon. River Gihon, I
Okay.
believe some writings on those, is the Nile River, which went to Egypt and then along the ocean, of course.
Okay.
It does-
Yeah, well, that would make sense that it says that waters the...
Yeah, that included really many continents, Europe, Asia to Turkey connection,
Okay.
that area, and then the Middle East and part of Africa. And I think looking at that, God is so inclusive, you're not going to stick one, Garden of Eden in one spot where only one or two populations are.
How big,
Okay.
how big was, how many acres did it include?
43. 43 acres.
But I just thought about that. When he was talking about how big it was, it don't ever say, does it?
Yeah. Well, like I said, there are just a lot of details we don't know about.
We don't know.
We don't know. And like Cement said, it may be that it could be in a completely different area of the world than what we were talking about. Most of the sources that I looked at all pointed toward it being in the Middle East area. They even said that there is an ancient river in the Saudi Arabia region that it was a river at one point and now is dried and is no longer there. And they suggested that might have been one of the other four. So that might lend some more credibility that maybe it was in that area. But like I said, we just don't know. Might have been in Africa, might have been in Europe. I'm not gonna punch you in the nose if you say something different. We just don't know for sure. But those are the suggestions.
Just know it's 43
We know
acres.
it's
That's all you need.
And where did you get 43? Did
I
you
just
just make
made
them?
them. Yeah.
I mean, I thought, why 43? Why not?
It's cast in stone now.
You know what Truman does now.
I probably should have given like
Exactly.
77.7 acres or something.
I thought, how
That
fast
would have
did
been
you
a
come
more
up with
biblical
43?
number.
Now, as our time material, we're going to remember.
Well, let's talk about question number 3. We've got a couple minutes left, and I think we can talk about this one. Now, when God meets Moses in the burning bush, y'all will remember this from Exodus chapter 3. God says, "This is my name." In fact, I've got the verse here on the screen for you, I believe. Nope, not that one. No, this is earlier instance. So let's look at the Exodus passage, Exodus chapter 3. I know this has been a while since we were in Exodus chapter 3. It's been a few months, but hopefully you'll remember a little bit of it. Exodus 3, in verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, and there's the name there, Yahweh, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. So a lot of people have assumed, suggested from this passage, that this is where God reveals that his name is Yahweh, which is in your Old Testament appears as all capital L-O-R-D, Lord, versus the Hebrew Adonai, which is capital L lowercase o-r-d. That's how those are distinguished in your Bibles. But Yahweh, YHWH, those being the consonants, we're not sure how the vowels were pronounced, but Yahweh is a guess that we have for how it would have been pronounced. So people thought, well, okay, that was God telling Moses, my name is Yahweh, before he had been called El Elyon, which means God Most High. He had been called Elohim, which just is the basic translation of God. But not until Exodus 3 does he reveal himself as Yahweh, or the Lord, quote unquote, with all capital letters there. But if that's the case, then you run into some difficult passages in Genesis. In Genesis 14:22, for example, but Abram said to the king of Sodom, with a raised hand I have sworn an oath to the Lord, to Yahweh, God Most High, El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth. That's one example, but it doesn't, and in fact Genesis 14 was the verse that came with the question that I was given. But it gets even worse than that, actually, because even earlier in Genesis than that do we have a description. In Genesis 4:26, Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of Yahweh. So very early on in Genesis, people are calling on the name of Yahweh. So what's going on here? Number one, what critical scholars have said is, well, they didn't really know it back then, but when they wrote the book of Genesis later, when Moses or when other people were writing or editing the book of Genesis later, they just went back and inserted that earlier, kind of as an editorial comment. So it's not really accurate that people this early on in human history would have called God Yahweh. That's what people from the critical perspective would say. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case at all. I don't think there's any reason that people couldn't have known him as Yahweh back then, at least not from a historical standpoint. The main barrier to that would be if Exodus 3 really is the revelation of this name for God. So what happens is that we start to rethink, well, what's really going on in Exodus 3? And what most scholars take Exodus 3 to be is not that it's the first time that God has given his name, but he is reiterating or re-revealing that my name is Yahweh back at that point. A name that had been known in the past, and during the time in Egypt, maybe had been mostly forgotten, had dropped out of use for the most part, but still would have been somewhat known to the people of Israel. In fact, if you think about the context of Genesis chapter 3, that's really the only answer that makes any sense. Moses is asking, when I go back to the Israelites in Egypt, who am I supposed to say sent me? And then God would give him a name that they had never heard before? How would that add to his credibility to be the one who's going to be God's instrument to deliver them? Wouldn't it make more sense if they said, oh yeah, Yahweh, I've heard that before. I recognize that. Maybe somewhere in the past, maybe it's not a prominent name anymore. Maybe it's one that Moses really probably wouldn't have thought of unless God had reminded him of it here. But if that's what's happening in Genesis chapter 3, then it makes it completely legitimate for people in Genesis chapter 4 and 14 to be using the name of Yahweh exactly as Moses tells us they are in the early chapters of Genesis. So that's the answer to that question. It's not a real difficult one necessarily, although it can be puzzling when you're dealing with that Exodus 3 text, because when you first read it, you're thinking, it sounds like God's giving his name here. But when you put all the evidence together, it seems to be pretty pretty strong that that's a re-revelation of the name. These are the occurrences of the divine name. If you want the good scholarly term for it, it's called the tetragrammaton.
The what?
Which means the four letters, the tetragrammaton. YHWH are the transliteration of the Hebrew consonants. And these are the books of the Old Testament where it occurs, and you see that in the book of Genesis, it's occurring 165 times. And some of those may be editorial. Some of them may be talking about the Lord said this. And that would be perfectly legitimate if it hadn't been revealed early for the editor to go back later and say it there. But the editor actually puts it on the lips of people in the early chapters of Genesis, and that's where you really have to reconsider that Exodus 3 is the initial revelation of it. All right, so there's the Exodus 3:14. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. So probably what happened is that God had revealed the name years and years before, generations before, and it was one of many names that God was called and was known by the Israelites. And now God is taking that name and is elevating it and saying, this is the name that you should call me for generations. And in Hebrew, it has to do, it's very closely related with the verb I am. And just a few verses earlier, he said, or in the previous verse, he said, I am who I am. That's who sent you. He's the God who exists, who's the self-existent one, the one who is. So that's where Yahweh most likely